My mother removed me from her, well, because I don't like my new father, but when I received $12 million, she demanded money from me, citing financial problems. I don't think anyone ever dreams of a childhood like mine. To me, family was supposed to mean safety, love, and warmth. But those were things I only saw on TV or heard other kids talk about. When my mother, Linda, remarried Richard, I thought maybe things would finally get better. I was wrong. Linda was distant. I don't know if she was always that way or if it happened slowly over time, but by the time I was old enough to notice, she was more like a roommate who drifted in and out of my life than an actual mom. She was constantly busy, always fussing over the house, or more likely over Richard and his son, Brian, who, to her, could do no wrong. It felt like I was the extra in a play where I was meant to be the main character. But instead, I was the outsider, the one person who never quite fit. From the start, Richard didn't try to hide his feelings about me. He acted like my very existence was a problem he had to deal with, and not in some subtle, I'm the man of the house way. No, he was obvious, loud, and relentless about it. There was this disgust in his eyes whenever he looked at me, like I'd interrupted his perfect life just by being around. He wasn't shy about his opinions either. Every little thing I did was wrong, and he made sure I knew it. "Jessica, why can't you be more like Brian?" he'd sneer, crossing his arms and shaking his head at me over the dinner table, where every meal was a test I seemed to fail. Brian, of course, was the golden child. He was Richard's son from his first marriage, and though he was just a year older than me, he had this quiet confidence that made everyone love him. Or at least that's how it seemed to me. Brian wasn't mean to me outright, but he didn't make it easier either. He watched me the way his dad did, with this smug indifference, like he knew I'd never be part of their world. I felt so alone in that house. My mom, Linda, seemed to lose her voice whenever Richard was around. She'd smile and nod at him, her eyes soft with this strange mixture of adoration and fear. It was like she'd forgotten I existed most of the time, only acknowledging me when Richard or Brian wasn't around. The few times I did ask her why she let Richard treat me the way he did, her responses were evasive, like she was too tired to even think about it. "Jessica, he's just strict. He wants the best for you," she'd say in that empty tone, not even looking at me as she spoke. I stopped asking her after a while, but it wasn't just words. Richard wasn't afraid to make sure I stayed in my place. I remember one time, I'd come home from school with a report card that wasn't perfect, mostly B's with a couple of A's. I thought I'd done well, considering how I had to sneak in study time with all the chores Richard assigned me. But as soon as I handed it to him, I knew it wouldn't be enough. This is what you call effort," he snapped, his voice dripping with disdain. He crumpled the paper in his hand, throwing it back at me. "Jessica, why can't you be like Brian? Do you see this?" He pulled out Brian's report card from the table drawer, showing off a perfect row of A's as if it were a piece of art. I wanted to yell, to tell him how unfair he was being, how much harder it was for me. But when I opened my mouth, the words caught in my throat, and all that came out was a weak, "I'm trying." He shook his head and muttered, "Try harder," before ordering me off to my room. And Linda? She just watched. She always just watched, a small, sad smile on her face, as if she was sorry but too afraid to say anything. I'd sit in my room, sometimes for hours, just staring at the walls, feeling like I was sinking into the floorboards. Those walls were the only things that heard my voice, the only things that seemed to hold my pain. They didn't judge, they didn't ignore, and they didn't make me feel like I was a mistake. There comes a point when you just can't take any more, and for me, that moment came one night after an argument that left me shaking. I was 17, weeks away from graduation, and I'd stayed up late finishing a school project. Richard had stumbled in late from some work gathering or whatever, reeking of alcohol. He took one look at me, slouched over my books at the kitchen table, and sneered, "What, you think you're going to get somewhere with that nonsense? Who do you think you are?" Something in me snapped that night. I didn't even respond. I just went to my room, shut the door, and sat there in the darkness, my head buzzing with one thought. I had to leave. I had to get out of this house before it swallowed me whole. The next morning, I walked to school feeling different, like a door had opened that I hadn't noticed before. My best friend, Sarah, noticed it too. Sarah was a quiet, steady presence in my life, someone who didn't pry but was always there when I needed her. She'd known about my family situation for years, and while I'd never told her everything, she understood enough. That morning, she looked at me with a mixture of worry and relief when I told her, "I'm leaving. I can't stay there anymore." Sarah nodded, not saying a word, just holding my hand. It felt like the first time someone had truly been on my side. That evening, I packed a bag with a few clothes, some cash I'd saved from tutoring sessions, and my favorite books, pieces of comfort I wasn't willing to leave behind. I didn't tell Linda or Richard. I didn't want their voices in my head, didn't want them dragging me down just as I was getting up the courage to break free. But, of course, things weren't that simple. Linda noticed the bag the moment she saw me in the hallway. She stood there, her gaze flicking between my face and the duffel bag, as if trying to process what was happening. "Jessica, what are you doing?" Her voice was thin, wavering, but not with the fear I'd expected. There was a strange calmness there, as if she'd known this was coming. "I'm leaving, Mom. I can't live here anymore." The words came out stronger than I'd imagined, a force I didn't know I had in me. She blinked, her mouth opening slightly before closing again. Then she laughed, a soft, bitter sound. "And where do you think you'll go? You don't have anything, Jessica. This world isn't kind to girls like you. I'd rather face whatever's out there than stay here," I said, not backing down. She sighed, shaking her head as if I was a child throwing a tantrum. "You'll be back," she muttered, turning away. I slipped out before Richard came home, the weight of her words trailing behind me. I didn't know what would happen, where I'd go, or who I'd turn to, but I felt lighter than I had in years. The first few nights, I crashed on Sarah's couch. Her family knew me well enough, and her mom offered to let me stay for as long as I needed. It was tempting, but I didn't want to burden them. I needed to stand on my own. One afternoon, as I was scanning job boards at the local library, I met someone who would change everything. Her name was Marissa, a bright-eyed woman in her early 30s who ran a local coffee shop. She noticed me staring at the job postings on the community board and came over, handing me a flyer. "We're looking for help at the shop. Interested?" I looked down at the flyer, the words barista needed, staring back at me. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. I nodded, and by the end of the week, I was clocking in my first shift. Marissa quickly became more than a boss. She was like the sister I'd never had, a mentor who seemed to understand what I was going through without me saying a word. She'd been through her own battles, and there was a strength in her that I admired deeply. She'd give me extra shifts when I needed them, slip me a sandwich when she thought I looked tired, and once, when she caught me crying in the break room, she just sat with me, her hand on my shoulder. Living independently was harder than I'd imagined. Rent, food, and bills piled up, and I found myself stretching every dollar. But for the first time, I felt like my life was mine, not a puppet show controlled by Richard and Linda. Every time I felt like giving up, I'd think about them and remember why I'd left. The thought of going back kept me going. One day, out of nowhere, Linda showed up at the coffee shop. She looked out of place among the cheerful decor and the smell of fresh coffee, her face tense and drawn. Marissa was at the counter, and I was in the back when she called me over. "Jess, someone's here to see you," she said, her voice careful, as if she could sense the tension. I walked out, my heart racing. Linda looked me up and down, her gaze cold and assessing. "Jessica, you've made your point. Now come home." I took a deep breath, standing my ground. "I'm not going back, Mom. I'm happy here." She laughed, a sharp, hollow sound. "Happy? Living like this? You're wasting your life, Jessica. You don't have a future here." Marissa, who'd been quietly observing from the counter, stepped in. "Excuse me, ma'am, but Jessica has a job and a place here. She's doing just fine." Linda's face twisted with anger, and for a moment, I thought she might scream, but instead, she just shook her head, looking at me with a strange sadness. "You'll regret this," she whispered, before walking out the door. It took me hours to shake off her words. Marissa was a steady presence, reminding me that I'd made a choice and that I had every right to build my own life. Still, Linda's visit left me rattled. As time went on, I began to find my rhythm. I saved up enough for a tiny studio apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't much, barely enough room for a bed and a table, but it was mine. Marissa helped me move in, and we spent the night painting the walls a cheerful yellow, laughing and talking like we'd known each other forever. Despite the challenges, I finally felt free. The fear and shame that had followed me for years started to fade, replaced by a quiet pride. I wasn't just surviving. I was building something for myself. But the past has a way of finding you. One evening, as I was closing up the shop, Richard showed up. He hadn't aged well. His face was harsher, his eyes colder than I remembered. He didn't say a word, just stood there, staring at me with that same contempt he'd always had. "What do you want?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady. He shrugged, glancing around the shop as if it disgusted him. "Linda's been worried. Thought I'd come check on you." I knew it was a lie. Linda wasn't worried about me. She never had been. "I'm fine. You can go now." He took a step closer, his voice dropping. "You think you're better than us now? Living here, working in this dump?" I felt my anger rise, but I kept my voice calm. "Maybe I am, Richard. Maybe I'm finally where I belong." He snorted, shaking his head. "You'll always be a disappointment, Jessica." But for the first time, his words didn't hurt. They didn't mean anything. I just watched him leave, feeling a strange sense of closure. I'd escaped, built a life for myself, and no one could take that away from me. I knew deep down that Richard had never thought of me as part of his family. But hearing it spelled out, seeing the proof right there in black and white, was something else entirely. I learned about the will almost by accident, but once I did, I couldn't unhear the words, couldn't unsee the papers that effectively erased me from any place I might have held in his life. It started with a phone call, a voice I didn't recognize saying, "Jessica, this is Martin Hale, the family attorney. We need you to come in for a reading of your stepfather's will." The words sent a shiver through me. I hadn't seen Richard or Linda in years by then, not since that final confrontation in the coffee shop. But I knew things hadn't been great at home. Sarah, my best friend, still lived in the area, and she'd keep me updated every now and then. Richard's health had been deteriorating, and Brian was taking on more responsibilities with the family's affairs. The younger son, Daniel, whom Richard had with Linda after I left, was already grown up now and had just started college. Apparently, Linda doted on him in the way she never had with me. I showed up at the law office on a rainy Wednesday morning, my heart pounding as I entered the building. The receptionist directed me to a small conference room where Linda, Brian, and a few others were already seated. Linda looked up when I walked in, her eyes widening in surprise before quickly narrowing. She didn't say anything, just turned back to the papers in front of her, but the air between us was thick with tension. Brian barely acknowledged me. He was seated next to a woman I didn't recognize, a young, sharply dressed attorney named Rachel Lang. Rachel glanced at me, her face expressionless, then continued flipping through her stack of documents. When Martin Hale finally arrived, he didn't waste any time. He took a seat at the head of the table, adjusted his glasses, and began reading from the will. I sat there, hands clenched in my lap, as he listed Richard's various assets, his investments, properties, bank accounts. It was more than I'd realized. All of it sounded so far removed from my life, like he was reading off a shopping list for someone else's family. Then Martin paused, looking around the room before he continued. "To my sons, Brian and Daniel, I leave the entirety of my estate to be divided equally between them. This includes all properties, financial accounts, and any remaining personal assets." I waited, holding my breath, waiting to hear my name. But it didn't come. The silence stretched on, and when I finally looked up, I saw Linda watching me with a satisfied look, as if this had been the final move in a game she'd been waiting to win. That's it." I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. Martin gave me a sympathetic look. "I'm sorry, Jessica. Richard didn't leave any provisions for you in his will." The words felt like a punch to the gut. I sat there, staring down at my hands, feeling a strange, numb emptiness. It wasn't about the money. I'd made a life for myself without their help. But this was a final confirmation, a rejection that hit me in a way I hadn't anticipated. I'd always known I was an outsider, but hearing it made official was something else entirely. After the meeting, as people were filing out, Rachel, the attorney I'd noticed earlier, came over and quietly handed me her card. "If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out," she said, her voice low and calm. There was something in her tone, a flicker of empathy that I wasn't expecting. I took the card, nodding, too stunned to say much else. I left the law office in a daze, the rain pounding down around me. Sarah called that evening, and I told her everything, the words tumbling out before I could stop myself. She listened, silent and steady, letting me pour it all out until I was hoarse. "They've always treated you like this, Jess. This doesn't change who you are," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But it feels like, I don't know, like I was never really there," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "You were there," she insisted. "You've just built something better for yourself, and they don't know how to handle that." Over the next few weeks, I tried to put it behind me. I buried myself in work, in the life I'd built, trying to ignore the ache that lingered. But it seemed like no matter where I went, I couldn't escape it. One night, Marissa, my boss at the coffee shop, found me sitting in the break room, staring off into space. "Hey, you okay?" she asked, sitting down across from me. I shook my head, unable to find the words. But Marissa didn't push. She just sat there with me, her hand resting on mine, a silent presence that reminded me I wasn't alone. It was around this time that Rachel, the attorney, reached out to me again. She'd left a voicemail, saying she had some information that might be relevant to me. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend I didn't care, but curiosity won out. I called her back and agreed to meet. We met at a small cafe, where Rachel laid out a few documents in front of me. "I did some digging," she said, her voice careful. "Richard didn't mention you in the will, but there were some unusual discrepancies in his financial records. I thought you might want to know." My heart pounded as she explained that Richard had set up several funds in Brian and Daniel's names over the years, transferring large sums of money out of his personal accounts. It wasn't illegal, but it felt like another slap in the face, a reminder that he'd always planned for them, always put them first, while I'd been left to fend for myself. Rachel looked at me, her expression softening. "I know this is a lot to process, but if you ever need help, or even just someone to talk to, I'm here." That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the weight of everything pressing down on me. The will, the rejection, the years of feeling like an outsider. It all felt like too much. I thought about calling Linda, confronting her, demanding answers, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. Over the next few weeks, I started seeing a therapist, someone Marissa recommended. Dr. Green was a calm, kind woman with a gentle voice who helped me start to untangle the web of emotions I'd been carrying for years. In our sessions, I began to see that my family's rejection didn't define me, that their decision to exclude me was a reflection of them, not me. One day, while going through old photos, I found one of myself as a little girl, smiling at the camera with a spark of joy in my eyes. Looking at that picture, I felt a surge of protectiveness. That girl deserved better, and it was up to me to give her the life she should have had. The will, the exclusion, the years of feeling like I didn't belong. All of it was painful, but it didn't have to control me. I'd built a life for myself, one filled with people who cared, who saw me for who I was. And that was something Richard could never take away. The call that changed my life came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was wiping down tables at the cafe, getting ready to close up, when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. Normally, I'd ignore it, but something made me answer. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, with a faint British accent. "Hello, is this Jessica Walker?" the woman asked. "Yes, speaking," I replied, wiping my hands on my apron. "My name is Alice Thompson. I'm calling on behalf of the law firm representing the estate of your late aunt, Mary Benson. Do you have a moment to speak?" I froze. Aunt Mary? I'd only met her a handful of times as a kid. She'd been my mother's older sister, a mysterious woman who lived halfway across the country. My memories of her were fuzzy, mostly images of a tall woman with an air of elegance and independence, always dressed in bold colors, always moving around with a purpose. She was one of those people you'd never forget, even if you didn't know them well? Yes, I remember her, I said slowly, trying to process what she'd said. But why are you calling me? Alice paused before responding. Your Aunt Mary passed away a few months ago, and in her will, she named you as one of her beneficiaries. I'd like to set up a time for you to come to our office and discuss the details. Beneficiary. The word hung in the air, as unreal as if she'd told me I'd won the lottery. I stammered out a response, agreeing to meet her at the law firm the next day. That night, I lay in bed, my mind racing. Aunt Mary's death was a shock, but the idea that she'd left me anything was almost impossible to grasp. We hadn't been close. She was more like a distant legend in my family. What could she possibly have left me? The next morning, I arrived at the law firm early, my nerves buzzing. The office was located in an elegant old building downtown, the kind of place I'd never imagined myself stepping into. Alice Thompson met me in the lobby, a tall woman in a sharp suit, with a serious but kind face. She led me to a small conference room, where she handed me a thick envelope. These are the details of your aunt's estate, she explained, watching me carefully. I understand this may come as a shock, but Mrs. Benson's assets amount to approximately $12 million. She left all of it to you. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. $12 million? My hands trembled as I held the envelope, my mind reeling. It felt like the universe had flipped upside down, like reality itself had bent into something unrecognizable. Are you sure? I whispered, barely able to find my voice. Alice nodded, her expression gentle. Mrs. Benson was very clear in her wishes. She wanted you to have the entirety of her estate. I sat there, stunned, as she went over the details. Aunt Mary had left me her mansion, a sprawling estate in Connecticut, along with various investments and accounts. The wealth was overwhelming, a sum I couldn't even comprehend. I'd spent my life scraping by, counting every penny, and now, suddenly, I was a millionaire. As I left the office, clutching the envelope to my chest, I felt like I was walking in a dream. The air outside was crisp, the city bustling around me, but everything felt distant, like I was floating above it all. I couldn't believe it. I'd gone from struggling to make ends meet to having more money than I could ever need. When I got back to my apartment, I sat on the couch, staring at the envelope, the shock slowly turning into a kind of giddy disbelief. I called Sarah, my voice shaking as I told her the news. She was silent for a moment before bursting into laughter. Jess, are you serious? This is insane. I know, I said, laughing along with her, my heart pounding. I don't even know what to do with it. It doesn't feel real. Over the next few days, I started making plans. The money opened up a world I'd never even considered. I could buy my own place, maybe even travel, finally get away from the shadow of my past. But as exciting as it was, there was a strange sadness that lingered. Aunt Mary had left me everything, yet I barely knew her. I found myself wondering about her life, her choices, and why she'd chosen me to inherit her fortune. One afternoon, I decided to visit the mansion. I'd never seen it, only heard stories about the grand house where Aunt Mary had lived. When I arrived, I was struck by the sheer size of it. A sprawling estate surrounded by towering oak trees, with ivy creeping up the walls. The house was beautiful, elegant yet mysterious, much like the woman who had owned it. I wandered through the rooms, each one filled with remnants of Aunt Mary's life. The furniture was tasteful, carefully selected, and the walls were lined with bookshelves overflowing with novels, poetry, and memoirs. I felt a strange connection to her as I explored, as if I was piecing together the life of a woman I'd always wanted to know but had never been given the chance. In the study, I found a photograph of Aunt Mary as a young woman. She was stunning, with the same confident expression I remembered from my childhood. I couldn't help but wonder what had driven her to leave everything to me, a niece she barely knew. As I looked around the room, I felt a sudden resolve. I wanted to honor her memory, to live up to the trust she'd placed in me. In the weeks that followed, I began to settle into my new life. I bought a small condo in the city, a beautiful space filled with light, where I could finally feel at home. I quit my job at the coffee shop, though saying goodbye to Marissa and my coworkers was harder than I'd expected. They'd been my family, my support system, and leaving them felt like closing a chapter of my life. But as grateful as I was, the inheritance brought complications I hadn't anticipated. News of my windfall spread quickly, and soon, people I hadn't heard from in years started reaching out. Old acquaintances, distant relatives, even high school classmates I barely remembered suddenly wanted to reconnect. It was as if the money had turned me into someone else, someone they wanted to know. Linda and Brian, too, found their way back into my life. It started with a letter from Linda, a neatly written note that arrived in the mail one evening. She didn't apologize, didn't even acknowledge the years of neglect, but she wrote about how proud she was of me, how she'd always known I'd be successful. The words felt hollow, a desperate attempt to rewrite history now that I had something she wanted. A few days later, Brian showed up at my condo, unannounced. He looked the same as I remembered, tall, confident, with that same smug smile that had always grated on me. But there was a glint of desperation in his eyes, a vulnerability I'd never seen before. "Jessica," he said, his voice smooth, too polite. "I thought we could catch up, you know? It's been a while." I looked at him, incredulous. "You mean since you and your dad ignored me? Since you made it clear I wasn't part of the family?" He shifted uncomfortably, forcing a smile. "Come on, Jess. That was a long time ago. We're family. I just want to make sure you're okay." I shook my head, feeling a surge of anger. "You didn't care about me then, and I doubt you care now. This isn't about family, Brian. This is about the money, isn't it?" He faltered, his composure cracking for a moment. "Look, things have been tough since Dad passed. Daniel's in college, and Mom's been struggling. We could really use some help." I stared at him, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. For once, I had the power. I wasn't the outsider anymore. I was the one holding the cards. But as tempting as it was to turn him away, to make him feel the rejection I'd felt, I knew it wouldn't change anything. "Brian," I said quietly, "I don't owe you or Mom anything. You made it clear a long time ago that I wasn't part of your family. So don't pretend now." He looked at me, defeated, before nodding and leaving without another word. As I watched him go, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The inheritance had changed my life, but more importantly, it had given me the freedom to finally stand up for myself. I wasn't the scared little girl they tried to control. I was free, independent, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly at peace. It started slowly, almost like a whisper. A few random calls, a polite email from a distant cousin, and a letter or two from people I'd nearly forgotten even existed. At first, I thought nothing of it, assuming these messages were just coincidence. But as the days went on, the pattern became impossible to ignore. News of my inheritance had spread through the family like wildfire, and suddenly everyone seemed to be crawling out of the woodwork. It wasn't long before Linda reached out. She'd been oddly quiet since her last letter, the one where she tried to paint herself as the supportive mother she'd never been. But this time, her tone was different. She called late one night, her voice a strange mix of warmth and desperation. "Jessica, sweetheart," she began, as if we were close. "How have you been? I was just thinking about you, hoping everything was going well." I nearly laughed out loud at the insincerity dripping from her words, but I held my tongue, playing along to see where this was going. "I'm fine, Linda. Just busy settling into everything." There was a pause, then a sigh. "Jess, you know, things have been a little hard for us lately. I mean, with your father's passing and all, it's been quite the struggle." Her voice cracked, as if she was trying to muster up tears. I almost felt a pang of sympathy, but I reminded myself of the years I'd spent being ignored, belittled, and dismissed. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, keeping my tone flat. Linda took a deep breath, then said the words I'd been expecting but dreading. "I was thinking, with everything you've inherited, maybe you could help us out a little? You know, as a family." There it was. The family card. The one she'd never played when I was a child, or a teenager, or even a young adult trying to make ends meet. Now, all of a sudden, I was family. I took a moment to gather my thoughts, then replied, "Linda, I haven't been a part of that family in a long time. You made that clear when you let Richard treat me the way he did, and when you cut me out of your lives after I left. Her voice tightened, a note of irritation creeping in. That was years ago, Jessica. We've all changed since then. You can't hold a grudge forever. Maybe not, I said calmly, but I also don't owe you anything. I built my life on my own. If you're struggling, I suggest you figure things out the way I did. The line went silent, and for a moment, I thought she'd hung up. But then she spoke, her voice cold. Fine, if that's how you want to be. But don't think for a second that I'll just forget about this. We are your family, whether you like it or not. And families help each other. She hung up, leaving me sitting there, stunned and furious. Her words echoed in my mind for days, eating away at the resolve I'd tried so hard to build. It felt like every time I took a step forward, they found a way to drag me back, to remind me of the twisted loyalty they thought they deserved. But Linda was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, I started receiving letters from Richard's side of the family, people I barely even remembered. An uncle named Steve, a cousin named Lisa, and a distant aunt named Karen all seemed to appear out of nowhere, each with their own sob story and plea for help. One evening, I found myself opening a letter from Karen, a woman I hadn't seen since I was a kid. The letter was long, full of flowery language and endless tales of hardship. She described how her husband had lost his job, how her children were struggling in school, how they were on the verge of losing their house. I almost felt sorry for her, but the tone of entitlement beneath her words was impossible to ignore. Jessica, she'd written, you've been so blessed, and it would mean the world to us if you could spare just a small portion of your inheritance. We're family, after all. The phrase "we're family" seemed to have become a mantra, a spell they thought would open the floodgates to my newfound wealth. But the more they pushed, the stronger my resolve became. I'd spent years scraping by, struggling to build a life for myself. Now that I'd finally found stability, they wanted to take it away, to claim a piece of it for themselves. One afternoon, just when I thought I'd seen it all, Brian showed up unannounced. I opened the door to find him standing there, looking disheveled and anxious. He'd always been so composed, so sure of himself, but now he looked almost desperate. Jessica, he said, his voice low. I need to talk to you. I stepped aside, letting him in, though every instinct told me to keep the door shut. He walked into my living room, glancing around as if he hadn't expected me to be doing so well. It was a small victory, seeing the surprise in his eyes. Brian, what do you want? I asked, crossing my arms. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, I know things haven't always been great between us, but the truth is, I need help. We all do. I raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. After Dad passed, things have been rough. The business he left behind isn't doing well, and with Daniel in college, it's just a lot. And Mom, well, she's not handling things well. I felt a pang of anger at the mention of Linda, but I kept my expression neutral. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, my voice calm. But I don't see how that's my responsibility. He looked at me, a mixture of frustration and disbelief on his face. Jessica, we're family. Isn't that supposed to mean something? I stared at him, wondering how he could stand there and say that after everything I'd been through. Family, I repeated, my voice icy. You mean the family that ignored me, excluded me, and made it clear I didn't belong? The family that decided I wasn't worth anything until I had money? Brian opened his mouth to respond, but I cut him off. Let me be clear, I said, my voice firm. I built this life on my own. I didn't get any help from any of you, and I don't owe you anything. You can either accept that or leave. He stared at me, a flicker of something like guilt in his eyes, before finally nodding. Without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding. After that, the letters and calls stopped. It was as if they'd finally realized that I wasn't going to give in, that I wasn't the scared, lonely girl they'd once known. I'd built a life for myself, one that I was proud of, and no amount of manipulation or guilt was going to take that away from me. It was as if my family was on a mission, dead set on squeezing every ounce of sympathy and dollar they could from me. After Brian's desperate visit, the pressure only escalated. The calls and messages started again, but this time they were less subtle, more aggressive. It was like they'd stripped away any pretense of kindness and gone straight for the jugular. Linda called almost every other day, alternating between tearful pleas and outright anger. "Jessica, how can you be so heartless?" she'd sob. "We're your family. After everything we've been through, don't you think you owe us something?" It didn't stop there. My Uncle Steve, who'd barely been in my life before, sent a long email accusing me of being selfish and greedy, reminding me of all the good times we'd shared when I was young. Memories that, as far as I could tell, only existed in his imagination. Each message was laced with guilt and entitlement, as if I'd somehow cheated them out of their rightful inheritance. One day, Linda showed up at my condo. I opened the door to see her standing there, her face lined with frustration and what looked like a forced sadness. I hesitated, but she pushed past me, making herself comfortable on my couch. "Mom, you can't just barge in here," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. She looked around, her eyes landing on the decor, the little touches I'd added to make the place my own. "You live in such luxury, Jessica. Do you even realize how selfish you're being?" she sneered. I crossed my arms, refusing to let her get under my skin. "Luxury? I live in a one-bedroom condo and work for everything I have, Linda." She sighed dramatically, as if she was already exhausted. "This is more than enough for one person. Meanwhile, your family is suffering. You know Daniel's tuition isn't cheap, and Brian's struggling with the business." I interrupted her, unable to keep the anger out of my voice. "And that's my responsibility, how? You made your choices, Linda, and so did Richard. You chose to push me aside, to treat me like I was nothing. Now that I have something you want, I'm suddenly family?" Her face twisted with a mixture of anger and frustration, but she said nothing. After a moment, she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. A few days later, I received a letter from a lawyer representing my family. Apparently, they were trying to stake a claim on Aunt Mary's inheritance, citing family obligation and claiming that my selfishness was causing them hardship. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. It was absurd, but it felt like a betrayal on a level I couldn't fully process. They turned to legal threats, trying to manipulate me into giving them what they felt they were entitled to. I immediately called my own attorney, Rachel Lang, the same lawyer who'd guided me through the initial inheritance process. She was a tough, no-nonsense woman who had a way of making people take her seriously. When I told her about the letter, she didn't seem surprised. "Jessica, these things happen all the time," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. "People get desperate when they feel entitled to something they don't have. Let's take a closer look at their claim and see what we're dealing with." She dug into the documents they'd sent, sifting through the legal jargon and fake claims they'd cobbled together. Within days, she'd uncovered the truth. It was all a sham. The documents they'd submitted were forged, a clumsy attempt to blackmail me into giving them a share of the inheritance. They'd even gone so far as to falsify signatures and had fake financial hardships to back up their claim. Rachel called me into her office with a triumphant smile. "Jessica, they're bluffing. Every document they submitted is either falsified or exaggerated. They have no legal standing whatsoever." A wave of relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a deep, simmering anger. How far were they willing to go? They lied, schemed, and tried to manipulate me, all in the name of family. I felt like I was seeing them for the first time, stripped of the masks they'd worn for years. Rachel filed a response, shutting down their claims with a detailed counterargument that left no room for doubt. Within a week, we received notice that their lawyer had withdrawn the case, quietly retreating in the face of Rachel's evidence. But it didn't end there. Linda was far from finished. Just when I thought things were settling down, I received another lawsuit, this time from my own mother, demanding $4 million for emotional damages and lost family support. I stared at the papers in disbelief. Linda was willing to take me to court, to drag my name through the mud, all for a payday. I sat across from Rachel in her office, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. "Can she actually do this?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Rachel shook her head, a steely determination in her eyes. "Jessica, this lawsuit is baseless. She has no grounds to stand on. It's a desperate move, nothing more. We'll get it thrown out, trust me." The court date came quickly, and though I dreaded seeing Linda again, I was ready. Rachel had prepared me for every possible scenario, and I felt more empowered than ever. Linda sat across the courtroom, her expression cold and unwavering, as if she believed she was in the right. But as Rachel tore apart her claims, exposing the baseless accusations and lack of evidence, Linda's confidence began to waver. The judge didn't take long to reach a decision. He dismissed Linda's case with prejudice, meaning she couldn't file it again. I felt a surge of vindication as I left the courtroom, finally free of their attempts to control and manipulate me. I'd won, not just in court, but in reclaiming my life from the family that had tried to break me. In the weeks that followed, I made the decision to cut all ties with them. It wasn't easy, but I knew I couldn't keep letting them poison my life. I blocked their numbers, deleted their messages, and instructed Rachel to handle any further communications. I was done with the lies, the manipulation, the endless cycle of betrayal. Instead, I turned my focus to the people who'd been there for me through everything: Sarah, Marissa, and a few close friends who'd supported me without question. They'd been my rock, my family in every way that mattered. I realized that I didn't need the approval or acceptance of people who only wanted to use me.